We're on Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. We are in the middle of our Mishnah. We've come to the point where the Mishnah has gone from one law to the next in a semi-tangential manner, as is the way of the Mishnah and the Gemara. And here we've got to the point where we're discussing the distinction between men and women with regard to ritual law. We got here because we were discussing the meal offering and the differences between a Kohen and an Israelite with respect to the meal offering, in that a Kohen's meal offering is always burnt in its entirety, whereas an Israelite meal offering is partially burnt while the rest is eaten by the Kohen. And this has been brought up in our Mishnah because the meal offering is indeed the offering of the Sotah. So if the Sotah woman and her husband primarily was a Kohen, then this meal offering would be burnt. And the same thing is true with any other meal offering that a Kohen might offer, is completely fully burnt, as opposed to the meal offering of every other Israelite, which partially is eaten. Having said that, the Gemara gets to the difference between a male and female Kohen with regard to this law, and that primarily the determining factor is whether she's married to a Kohen. And if she's married to a Kohen, whether she's an Israelite or not, because her husband, the Kohen, owns some portion of that offering, therefore gets the law of the Kohen meal offering and is entirely burnt. So from there, the Mishnah went on to discuss further distinctions between male and female Kohenim with regard to the law of contacting impurity, whether she's stripped of her status in terms of whether she can eat teruma or not. And now we get to distinction between men and women in ritual law in general. And that's where we are. So the Mishnah reads, Ma bein ish le-ish, you can see I highlighted on the screen. What's the difference between men and women? In general, whether Israelite or Kohen doesn't matter. With respect to certain ritual law, says the Mishnah, Ha'ish, Paireya, Upairim. When a person becomes a Matzorah, and a person is afflicted with spiritual skin discoloration, people often translate it as leprosy, but leprosy conjures up images of a medical condition, when here it's not a medical condition, and here it's an affliction by the hands of heaven, spiritual affliction that's manifest in a physical discoloration in the skin. And there are all kinds of laws regarding how one determines whether this is indeed constitute someone who's a saras or not. But if someone is determined to be a mitzorah, that's how you refer to someone who's been afflicted with the skin discoloration and is confirmed as such, then one of the things a man would have to do if you were confirmed to be a mitzorah, to be one who possesses the skin discoloration, which is a physical manifestation of a spiritual illness, one of the things he would have to do is let his hair grow and render his clothing, tear his clothing. So this is true of a man. But a woman does not have to let her hair grow, and a woman does not have to rend her garments. There's a certain dignity afforded to a lady, and she doesn't have to do that kind of appearance demeaning activity. Whereas a man renders his garment and and lets his hair grow, a woman does not have to do that. Another distinction between men and women in ritual law, Ha'ish madir es benoi benazir. A man can impose upon his son, who is a minor, that his son become a Nazir. A Nazir, of course, is a person who decides that he wants to voluntarily live a more ascetic lifestyle, and he can't become impure, he doesn't drink wine, he lets his hair grow, it applies actually to a man and a woman. A man or a woman can choose to live an ascetic lifestyle, and the person, a minimum Nazareth is 30 days, but a person could decide how long they want this to last. And then there's a process at the end of their allotted time for which they volunteered to be a Nazir. They also go through a ritual process of reintegration to society, including cutting the hair and bringing a certain korban, a certain offering, and so on. So the Mishnah here tells us that a man, a father, can impose a Nazareth on his child who's a minor. And then this Nazareth, this obligation to be a Nazir is conferred upon the child and remains with him even as he becomes an adult, in accordance with the determination that the father has so imposed on his son. But a woman does not have that same ability. A mother cannot impose upon her child that the child be a Nazir, but a father can do so to his son. So this is distinction number 2 between men and women with respect to ritual law. Distinction number 3, Ha'ish migaleach ben al nazirus aviv. Literally translated, it means a man can shave his hair on the Nazareth of his father. Rashi explains for us, if the father exercised his right, as we described in the previous case, and imposed upon his child that the child be a Nazir, and then the father designated a certain offering, a certain animal, let's say, to be his offering at the end of his Nazir process. And in the interim, the father passes. Now the son is also a Nazir, and the son inherited now an offering that his father, the Nazir, had designated to be a korban, to be an offering. So the Mishnah is here teaching us that the Nazir of the father and the son are connected. The father became himself a Nazir and imposed it upon his child. So the offering that the father designated to be his offering at the end of his Nazir process can be used for the child. When the child finishes his Nazir time period and he shaves his hair and he goes through the process of reintegration to society, he can use the offering that his father had designated for his Nazir, even though his father has passed and his father is no longer. So this is true of a father and a son, but this is not true of a daughter and her father. Same scenario. A father imposed upon his daughter and himself a certain amount of time to be a Nazir. The father designates an offering for when the time comes that his Nazir time is up. In the interim, the father passes away. The daughter, who is a Nazir herself, a Nazira herself, she now has to go through the process at the end of her Nazir time of reintegration to society, including bringing an offering, but she cannot bring the offering of her father, unlike the son who can use the offering of his father. So this is distinction number 3 between men and women with respect to ritual law, all of which has been related so far to the question of Nazir. We're about to move away from Nazir. So just to recap the 3 laws of Nazir that are different between men and women. Number 1, a man lets his hair grow and tears his clothing. I'm sorry, that was about, the first was Mitzvah, and the second 2 is Nazir. I'm sorry. When it comes, the first is, if a man is determined to be a Mitzvah, that is the person who has this skin discoloration as a result of spiritual affliction. If a man has been determined to have this saras, to be a Mitzvah, saras is a description of the affliction, and Mitzvah is the name of the person. So if a man is determined to be a Mitzvah, considering that he has saras, the skin discoloration, then he lets his hair grow and tears his clothing. A woman does not. That's distinction number 1. And distinction number 2 and 3 is with respect to the law of the Nazir, that a father can impose upon his child that he be a Nazir. A mother cannot impose that upon her child. Distinction number 1. Distinction number 2 is a child, a son, who has inherited the Nazir from his father, may use the offering his father has designated for his own Nazir process if his father is now deceased, whereas a daughter cannot use the Nazir offering of her father, even if her father is the one that imposed the Nazir on her. From here, the Mishnah gets the distinction between mother and father, husband and man and woman in the law of marriage, betrothal. For the next two laws, one is with respect to the law of betrothal, and one is with respect to the law of slavery. Just make the following introductory remarks. Often, one hears the question, how is it the Torah sanctions slavery? There's laws about slavery, how to treat a slave, and how one acquires a slave, how one sells a slave, and so on. Especially since there could be such a slave as a minor, specifically a young girl. As we're going to learn, a father can sell his daughter into slavery. That's a crass way of translating it, but that's the way it's often perceived. And similarly, as we're going to learn, a father can marry his daughter off at a very young age, in fact, from 3 years old and over. And this, to our modern sensibilities, seems rather bizarre. And we'd be right to think of it as bizarre. And a father who would exercise the right to do this would be a very questionable father. And I would venture to say the father should be brought to court if one were to exercise nowadays his right to sell his daughter into slavery, God forbid. But to understand where the Torah is coming from, we should understand the history a little bit and understand the context of these laws. The first thing to know is Torah does not say that one should sell oneself into slavery. On the contrary, Torah does not say that one should sell their daughter into slavery, and on the contrary. The proper way to look at these is it's regulation on an industry that already exists. Meaning to say, for most of human history, and even today in many parts of the world, slavery exists. Slavery does exist. And slavery that existed for much of history is not necessarily the slavery that we think of when we think of slavery in the South, pre-Civil War in the United States. Certainly there was that kind of slavery throughout history. That's not the majority of slavery throughout history. The majority of slavery throughout history, for the most part, was really a financial agreement in which a single individual understands or feels that their financial prospects are extremely low because of maybe because they were born in the lower end of society, or for whatever reason they feel that their prospects to make any decent living is very low. But they can work. They know how to work, so they'll go to somebody else and they'll say, "Look, we'll make an agreement for the next couple of years, 5 years, whatever the arrangement is. Next couple of years, I will work for you. I'll do whatever you want, and in exchange, you'll feed me and house me." And that's what slavery was. That's what it is. It was a financial arrangement between the slave owner and the slave. Right?
It was more of a work agreement.
It's a work agreement, but that work agreement went deeper than employee today. Where the employee goes home to their own place and takes the wages and does whatever they wish with the wages. And much more than that, the owner had to provide for them, feed them, house them, take care of them, and in exchange, whatever I wanted, you did. I woke you up in the middle of the night and said, "I need a drink of water." You got to give me the drink of water, right? But if you get a reputation as a bad slave owner, you're not going to get many people coming towards you and say, "Hey, please, can I work for you?" If you get a reputation of taking care of your slaves, you'll have plenty of slaves lining up, saying, "Hey, I'll exchange my labor for you taking care of me."
So
right?
When did the whips and chains come in then, and the torture?
Yeah, so a lot of that was around, okay, so because the owner owned the slave, many of them took advantage of that and whipped and chains and all the rest of that, which all happened, which is what Torah comes to prevent. Torah regulates this industry and tells an owner, you can't do that. You got to feed your slave before you feed yourself. You break his bone, you let him free. So all the laws of Torah are not, hey, go get slaves. It's, this industry called slavery, here are all the slaves' rights. And don't break them. And when you leave, you got to leave him with a lot, give him a lot. When he leaves, you got to give him a lot of cash. You hurt him too much, you let him free. All of these, all the laws of Torah and slavery are actually regulation on a industry that existed, not sanctioning or even encouraging the industry at all. Certainly, there was such a slavery. There was a level of slavery that got worse, which was not someone who exchanged his labor for financial support, but there was times when one country conquered another country, and if I conquered another country, I can take slaves, right? And it became a whole industry. Like it became a whole industry where you buy slaves and sell slaves and trade them across continents and whatnot, and certainly treated in horrible forms and fashions. But at the core of it, that's not what it was. The core of it was a financial arrangement, and the Torah comes to regulate that industry. And the same thing is true of daughters being sold into, quote, slavery, and daughters being sold to marriage. It was a financial arrangement. If a guy had children, he had daughters, and he couldn't feed them, the man could not feed them. So it would be of benefit to himself and to his own daughter if he found someone who he thought was a kind person and who he thought was a nice person, and the person was wealthy enough and say, look, in exchange for X, my daughter will marry you. And it was just a straight up financial arrangement between the people, and Torah came to regulate that and say, okay, if such an arrangement is going to be made, then here are the rules. Here's how you have to treat her. She can say no if she decides she wants to back out. The girl can say no, which in other parts of the world outside of Torah, a girl says no, your father sold you, you're done, you're over. There's no such thing as a girl saying no. Torah comes and says no, we're regulating this industry. She can say no, right? So it would seem to me that this is the proper lens through which to understand the laws of slavery in Torah.
Yeah, but Torah can predate slavery. So how can it impose
Slavery is as far back as human history.
Right.
So Torah is given in human history, not before human history,
okay.
right? So the industry already exists way before Torah comes around. I mean, we were slaves in Egypt before we got the Torah, right? Right. Okay. So having said that, now let's read the Mishnah. Mishnah reads, Amud Aleph 23a. Amud Aleph 23a. So the Mishnah reads, having given this little introduction. Where are we here? Ha'ish mekadesh es bitoy. The father holds the legal right to marry off his daughter. So, and not just to marry off his daughter, but he can actually even receive the marriage item, right? The marriage is solidified, the betrothal, I should say, is solidified when the husband gives the wife something of value. Today we use a ring. Back then it could have been anything else. And says to her, with this value, with this ring, with this coin, you're now my wife. So the father actually can accept it on the daughter's behalf. The guy can go to the father and say, here's the ring, here's the coin, and in exchange for that, your daughter's now my wife. If he so chooses to go through this arrangement for whatever reason, most likely financial reason, as we explained. So the father has that right. But a mother does not have that ritual right as an R-I-T-E, not right as an R-I-G-H-T, but right as an R-I-T-E, that the right is the father's to accept the Kiddushin, the betrothal, and not the mother. So this is another distinction between men and women in ritual law. Another distinction, says the Gemara, again in the context of the history we just explained, Ha'ish moicher es bitoy. A father reserves the right to sell his daughter as a maidservant, as we explained before. But a mother cannot do that, cannot sell her daughter into maidservantry. This is also only up to a certain age. Once she becomes a certain age and she now has autonomy, the father can no longer marry her off or sell her. Okay. 3 more distinctions between men and women, and then we'll get to the Gemara tomorrow, God willing. Ha'ish niskal arum. If a man is found guilty of capital punishment by stoning, literally by stoning, and again, we're not learning Sanhedrin right now, but the process of stoning is not what we see of in the movies, where some guy's tied to the rope and everybody's throwing stones at the guy, and the guy dies slowly in a torturous and horrible death. But actually, stoning happens to the person is pushed off a certain height, and it's designed in such a way that the person dies upon impact. So the person dies very, very quickly. As with all capital punishment, it's designed in Torah to be as quick, as smooth, and as painless as possible. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin says multiple times, the reason is because you have to love your fellow as yourself. And therefore says the Gemara, choose for him a, quote, nice death or a clean death.
So what about Sreifa?
Sreifa also, the person they take hot lead and they pour it down his throat.
Oh, wow.
So he dies very, very quickly.
It's not like
it's not burning at the stake. Not an totafi. What do they call it? Atefet? What?
Burning at the stake.
Yeah, what were they called? There was a terminology for it.
Auto de fe. Auto de fe.
Thank you. That's it. It's not. It wasn't that. No. Anyway, and also we learned a number of times that for a person to be liable for capital punishment was very difficult. Right? The Gemara says that two different versions of the Gemara, but the Gemara says if a court killed one person once in the 7 years or something, it's an evil. It's considered a bad court. Yeah, people died of capital punishment in Texas more often than they do in all of Torah history. But at any rate, in theory, if a person was found guilty for one such crime where the person is liable for capital punishment by stoning, so if it's a man, niskal arum, he gets killed, he's put to death naked, without any clothing. But a woman is afforded a little more dignity. And a woman does not get killed naked. She's wearing clothing when she goes through this process. Second distinction between men and women in the process of capital punishment. Ha'ish nitla, after the stoning, the man is then hung, at least for 1 day. The Gemara in Sanhedrin again goes through all the details, but the man is hung for a day to fulfill the verse which says people should know, so he's hung. But a woman is afforded more dignity and not hung. That's distinction number 2 between men and women with respect to the law of capital punishment. Final distinction between men and women mentioned in this Mishnah. Ha'ish nimcher b'gnevasa. A man is sold into slavery if he stole. That is to say, right, there is the way in which a person would be sold into slavery, as I described earlier, as a financial arrangement. The person feels that he can't afford his own life, even though Torah actually discourages him from doing so. But if he feels like this is the only way for him to survive, he can exchange his labor in return for being housed and fed and clothed and so on, and all the rights that come along with being a slave. But there's another way in which a person might end up in slavery, which is if a person stole, and if he steals, he's liable to pay back. But it turns out he can't afford it. So then he's sold into slavery so that he can use the money he gets from being sold into slavery. He can use that money to pay for his debt after having stolen. To pay for that debt, he can be sold into slavery, and he gets all the rights of a slave. Right? It's kind of like, I'm sure there were people who gamed the system just like people game the system today. I'm sure there are plenty of people today who, rather than living on the streets, do petty crimes. They can end up in jail, and they're fed and they're housed and they're put into a warm room. There are people who do this, unfortunately. So I'm sure
it was like a sentence.
Not a sentence, but a way to earn cash so you can pay for the stealing. So I'm sure there were people who stole, had no money, sold into slavery, and now they're fed, they're housed, they're clothed, they have all the rights of slaves and so on. I'm sure there are people who did that. But anyway, if a man does this, then he is sold into slavery as a result of having stolen and now can't afford to pay. But a woman is afforded more dignity, and if she stole, she is not sold into slavery to pay for her debt. This concludes the Mishnah, and God willing, tomorrow we'll get to the Gemara, which takes us back to the question of the Israelite married to a Kohen and the law regarding their meal offering and the fact that it is entirely burnt, unlike the meal offering of a Israelite, which is only partially offered on burnt on the altar. The rest is eaten by the Kohen. That, God willing, coming tomorrow. A wonderful day, Yidden.
All the very best to you, Rabbi.
Good day.
Have a good day, everyone. God bless you all. Thank you.